Right. Hi, everybody. I'm really sorry about the Zoom IDs and the passwords. I still don't know why that didn't work for a lot of you, but in place of that, I'm just going to record a lecture on I guess what you guys missed. So uh, I guess last week we'd started on the Bronze Age collapse and the world in 500 BCE. So I didn't get through all of that, so here we are. So we're going to be focusing on East Asia right now, mainly China. All right. So one of the big belief systems in China is Confucianism, because at the time China was in the midst of the Warring States period. Yeah, no bonus points if you can guess what happened in the Warring States period. And so, given all of the conflict and all the fighting, a lot of people ask the question, how do you organize your society? How should you make sure that your society is stable and virtuous and good? Well, according to Confucius, which is not his actual name, how you do this is you organize society like it's a family. So here we go. So as you can tell, it's all based around the senior and the junior relationships. It's also very patriarchal, as in the males over the females. And um, this is, I mean, it probably Confucius being male probably has something to do with it. And this will be kind of like the blueprint for a lot of Chinese society um, up to the present. So the next belief system that we're going to be looking at is Taoism, which is just very different from Confucianism. And Taoism is all about living in harmony with nature. It's it's also very much like a personal philosophy. If you guys ever hear about your what are they called, hippies, or if you see hippies, talk to hippies, chances are a lot of them are Taoists, where their belief is okay, we're all part of the world, and let's just chill. It's a very, very nice religion. Um, and Taoism is also very good because it's very, very accepting of other groups, and it ends up being mixed in with a lot of other belief systems to create syncretisms, such as Neo-Confucianism. So what a syncretism is it's a merger of multiple belief systems together. So, for example, let's take a look at Christmas. If you guys have heard the story of the 10 Days of Christmas, or the song 10 Days of Christmas, you might ask, why are there 10 days of Christmas if Christmas is only one day? And it's not because Jesus' birth lasted 10 days. That would be pretty horrible. But it's because Christmas is not really the birth of Jesus. It is initially a Roman festival called Saturnalia, which you can probably guess Saturnalia, was not Christian. And it was just a big party that everyone had when winter was at its coldest and darkest to have fun, have some hope. And people really loved it. It was 10 days of just festivity. And when the Christians came in and they were like, "Oh no, you don't. That's not good. That's a pagan festival." People did not want to give up Saturnalia. So what the Christians did is they're just okay, you know, well, what if we just say this is the birth of Christ? Because I mean, it should be around then, and then we can just just slap Christ onto it, and then people will be fine, and people were fine, and that's how we have Christmas, more or less. Um, so then I guess next we're going to be going on to Africa. So Africa is big. It has a lot of issues with sources because of Europeans. And so we're not going to be doing African history justice in any way whatsoever. So what was happening around at this time were the Bantu migrations, which is when the Bantu speaking people, this is a language group, not really one ethnicity, migrated from West Africa and into like the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So what sub-Saharan Africa means is this right here, this orange, is the Sahara Desert. So submarine, the well, I guess submarine subtitles, those things are all like underneath. Yeah, this is underneath the Sahara Desert, or not really underneath, but south of the Sahara Desert. So what the Bantu introduce is a lot of new farming techniques, especially involving bananas. And all that actually really helps with nutrition, and a lot more food means that you can have a lot more people. Not only that, is they also introduce a lot of metalworking, a lot of metal tools to this area, meaning that then you can use a bunch of tools for making farming easier and for making pretty much everything else easier. And so the thing is, though, is that the Bantu are not one people. You can tell from this image, which is all of Africa's ethnicities, is that Africa is a very, very diverse place. It's not something that I'm an expert at, but this doesn't mean that it's not important. What this does mean, though, is that it's going to be extremely hard to make any generalizations about Africa. Also, for those who are wondering, Africa is not one country. So it's very diverse, and yeah, it is going to be very hard to cover just because the Europeans came in and they destroyed a lot of records, and also it's like very hard to find things that have been like translated into English. But anyways, going back to the Bantu, is like the Bantu kind of social order, very, very, very generally, is that it's based around like kinship groups, which are basically large families that are all, a group of these as like a town or a village. And the whole like idea behind this is just the people you should trust the most are people who are related to you. That's not a very uncommon thing. But these aren't really tribes because I mean a lot of these are actually like very large civilizations and very complicated civilizations. And one of the like exceptions in Africa is that like we've seen a lot of patriarchal societies, but a lot of African societies or sub-Saharan African societies are matriarchal, meaning that power is passed down by women or oftentimes held by women. So later we'll get into the Luba people of the Congo, and what they not only have like matriarchal rulers, but they have matriarchal rulers who have dead spirit kings living within them, which is so cool. But yeah, that'll be a topic of a later date. So time, I gonna transfer the recording, and now let's get to week 3. So these are the classical empires. This is Rome, Alexander, Han, China. This is what a lot of people think of history. Like this is pretty famous. And so, well, let's go through that. First things first, it's probably the time. This is kind of an issue, just because there are some questions about this. So essentially, how timing or dating works is that everything is based around the birth of Jesus, or at least where we think the birth of Jesus was, which is it doesn't apply to like everyone, but it's just custom. So yeah, here we go. So the Bronze Age collapse is 1200 BCE, which is like I guess 1200 years before the birth of Jesus. And so when you're in this BCE era, or BCE means that what you do is you count down as you get closer to the birth of Jesus. So let's say like 700 years after the Bronze Age collapse, it will be 300 BCE. But then after you get to Jesus, and then you are in the Common Era, or it says like in the year of our Lord. After in this period, you count up. So it's like last year was 2019. Now we're in 2020. Yeah, I think that should be helpful. Um, Agricultural revolution is 8,000 years before this timeline even starts, meaning it's about two timelines before this timeline, if that makes sense. As in, yeah, sure. Antiquity is the time period that we're going to be covering today. After that, it'll probably be the Middle Ages, but that'll be probably 2 weeks from now. So let's get into Mediterranean history. This is a very extensively covered topic in my Rome class, and I mean, yeah, sign up for that if you want some more depth, which is shameless plug-in. So the Mediterranean world is based around the Mediterranean Sea, this area, and so this will be kind of like what determines basically like all of Mediterranean history. So Um, let's start off with classical Greece. So this would be like the 700s BCE to the 300s BCE. So Greece at this time was a bunch of city-states, as in each city is its own country. They didn't think of themselves as all Greeks, and they called themselves, well, like Athenians. They named themselves after their cities. So Athenians, Spartans, Thebans, not Greeks. This would be like if we called ourselves San Diegans and had like San Diego as its own country rather than Americans. So, they also tended to fight each other a lot. Like they did not get along very well, and they actually thought of war as like a very religious thing and something that was like good and honorable, which is I guess you can see a lot of those like scars on the modern world, where we do have like all these action movies that are all about war, and there's a lot of fascination with war. They were also extremely patriarchal, meaning that like as you can see, only men are allowed to really participate in society. I'll get into that later, but as you can tell from this picture, Greece is a mess. Most of these city-states aren't even shown on this map because this is still a simplification. Uh, Pretty much every one of these dots is its own country, which is like occasionally very confusing while studying ancient Greek history. Like, the Greeks are almost never united, and it'll take the only times Greece is ever like close to united, and even then not really, is when it faces foreign threats. So in this case, it's going to be the Persians, or I guess like it's the Persians who do end up doing that when they invade Greece and fail. So democracy is one of the things. So actually, let's probably like get to a more basic level. So the reason why everyone cares about Greece so much, why everyone's so interested in Greece so much, is because they are like the forerunners, the people who kind of create the idea of a Western civilization, like an American civilization or European civilization that currently dominates the world, at least. And so what they introduce is democracy, or at least like the first forms of democracy. For us, I think we'd consider it very much diet democracy because not everyone can vote in these early Greek democracies. It's like, rule by the people, democracy, demos meaning people, but not really, because people in this case for the Greeks is, I guess, a very narrow term, because for them, a democracy only involves rich, educated men, which means no women, no slaves, no foreigners, and no one who is remotely poor. Why is that? So that probably goes into their ideas of education, because they believe that only an educated society, or only a society with educated people, should be able to control itself. Because if these people have a voice in government, they should know what they're doing. And so this is why like it ends up being rich people, rich men, who end up participating in democracy because they're the people that Greece gives education to. because there is no such thing as a public education yet. Their education system is probably the most similar to our English classes because they're all focused on reading, writing, speaking out loud to people. It's not as much focus on like math, science, things like that. What the Greeks also invent is history from this dude named Herodotus, this man right here. So, Herodotus is very interesting because prior to Herodotus, pretty much everyone recounts history either by just recording things as they happen or they just tell stories. Herodotus kind of blends the two together because he takes the story of like extremely long periods of time. He takes like the events that happen to a country over like centuries and tries to organize that all into one cohesive story that you can listen to or read, which is that's our class. Herodotus, as you might notice, is a man. Everyone else here is a man. That's because Greece, again, is very patriarchal. So you can see here, they keep all the women like kind of like segregated and close together, and the Greeks believe that women should be kept inside of the house 24/7. And like I mean 24/7. Like if you were a woman in Greece and you were seen on the street, people would think that you were some kind of criminal, which yeah, it's bad. And I mean, that kind of patriarchal society is like one of the legacies of Greece, probably one of the ugliest legacies of Greece. They also introduced Western philosophy, which is, I guess, the idea of like what is a good way to live? Like why are we on this planet? Why are we alive? Like what should I be doing with my life? And what is just? What is justice? What is fair? Do they matter? How should you treat other people? So I mean, these are all like explorations of philosophy universally, but the Greeks kind of like get us started on how we think about things. Like the whole idea of like treat other people as you would like to be treated. That's largely a Greek. At least it came to us from the Greeks. Philosophers were not always popular, as shown by this picture, the death of Socrates. Socrates was a very famous philosopher who questioned a lot of people. People did not like being questioned, and so they had him drink poison. You can tell though he's not really bothered. He's like, even as he's reaching for the poison, he's still teaching people. Quite the man. So, next we have Alexander the Great. He's probably the main reason why we care about Greeks, because he is, because he conquers the Achaemenid Empire. Actually, here's like the idea of like how big the empire he conquers is. And the Achaemenids, if you remember them from last week, you probably don't, but the Achaemenids is the Persian Empire. And they controlled 40% of the world's population. Alexander probably controlled like 1%. He had a very tiny army, and he still pulled it off. As you can tell, he was like 33 years old when he died. And he conquered this whole thing in just 10 years, which no one else will ever do. This would be like something similar would be like if someone, let's say like if Mexico conquered the entire US in a decade. Like that'd be crazy. Like, but he did. And his empire is why we remember the Greeks. Because all of this area now gets to hear about Greek philosophy, Greek democracy, Greek literature, and Greek thinkers. So this is how we get Greek culture spreading across the world. If not for Alexander, Greece probably would have just been some random thing that would probably belong most on a trivia, as part of trivia, while we're all going around speaking Persian. So, um, but the thing is, what Alexander does is he, he dies young because Alexander was one an alcoholic, so he really really loved abusing alcohol, which is why you should not drink. And two, he had fought a lot of battles. He'd been wounded, and three, he'd just gone down a pleasure barge down the Nile, which is at the time had a lot of mosquitoes on it, and Alexander might have had malaria. This all means that Alexander died when he was 33 without a real heir to the throne to inherit his kingdom. So his generals split up the empire and fight each other. As you can tell by this, that is a mess. It is extremely brutal. And this is all for personal control, personal power, which the Greeks are not averse to. So, but out of this period comes one of the weirdest stories you'll ever hear about the ancient world. These are the adventures of Alexander's body. So after Alexander the Great dies, his best general Perdiccas, is kind of mostly ruler of most of the empire. And so he sends Alexander's body back to Greece to be buried. But then on the way, one of the other generals, this guy named Ptolemy, steals the body and then brings it to Egypt. Perdiccas is kind of annoyed at this, so he goes to Egypt with an army and tells Ptolemy to give Alexander's rotting corpse back. Ptolemy says no, because Ptolemy knows something. He knows if he can have Alexander's body, then that means that he can have a kind of symbol that he is the actual person who should have Alexander's empire. So Ptolemy and Perdiccas fight each other, and Perdiccas loses. Perdiccas dies, and then after that, without this central ruler, it all just goes to like, it's all like everyone for themselves. Ptolemy doesn't actually really have the power to take over the whole empire, but then he founds his own kingdom in Egypt. And he builds a super fancy tomb around Alexander's body, and that tomb eventually becomes the model for the tombs of later Roman empires, all the way until the body just like mysteriously disappears, which is very like one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. So here are the Diadochi, the successors. And so let's start out with the well, I guess you know the Ptolemies already. But then here's the Seleucids, who are the biggest by far, but they also have the biggest border to defend, especially with the Indian Mauryan Empire, which is going to end up being quite the threat. This period of history, where all of these countries are basically always fighting at war with each other, has been called an era of murderous musical chairs. And that's because out of all of the original generals of Alexander the Great, only Ptolemy will die peacefully. Everyone else dies horribly. And that's because whoever is on top at the time just gets ganged up on by everyone else. And so the empire splits into all these different kingdoms. By the way, Rome and Carthage are not successors. Neither are the Mauryans. But what Rome will eventually do is it'll eat all of the successor kingdoms, and all in the space of about one lifetime. Speaking of Rome, let's see. Let's talk about Rome. So Rome started off as a tiny little city in Italy that was filled with a bunch of criminals, murderers, all the like. But then it was also initially a kingdom, which were eventually driven out But the Romans eventually rise and they conquer the Mediterranean with a mixture of brute force, adaptation, and alliance. So, what do I mean by adaptation? Well, the Romans, they are very smart with how they conquer things. They're very pragmatic, as in whenever they run into something that gives them trouble, they take it or they copy it. So let's just look at this Roman soldier right here. This shield is taken from another Italian tribe that was giving the Romans a bunch of trouble. This sword is from Spain. This armor and this helmet is from France, or are from France. So they're very, very adaptive. They're also a slave state, as you can see here, which is one of the worst things about the Roman Empire, because they take millions of slaves until the point that basically the entire Roman workforce has been displaced by slaves. Like slaves have all the jobs, and there's very little room for actual Romans, meaning that when Romans actually do get jobs, which is actually kind of rare, that they have to work at basically the same level of like conditions as the slaves, because otherwise it's just cheaper to have a slave rather than an actual paid worker. So this will be very, very bad for the Roman Empire in the long run, and it means that the Romans will, at the fall of the Roman Empire, eventually when it happens, it's kind of a good thing. We are not getting to that yet, though. So here's the Roman Republic, which is what happens when the kings get driven out. The whole idea behind the Roman Republic is that one person should not have enough power to take over the whole republic. So they divide the power between a lot of different branches of government and a lot of different offices, which is something you can kind of see in the modern American system, where we have the executive, judicial, and legislative branches. And this is all about competition between all these powerful families for who can get these offices, who gets to be president. Although there are two presidents under the Roman system. Competition for this, though, gets more and more heated because everyone really, really needs this. Because, if you don't get power and if you don't get money, you'll probably end up on the street and you won't have a job to take because all of those have been taken by slaves. So it goes more and more violent until the swords come out and the civil wars just take the republic apart. Before then, though, we have Scipio Africanus, who was a general who won a bunch of battles and then, kind of just had a normal political career after that. He did not turn his army on the city, and so he's the kind of like one of the Roman heroes. Someone who did turn their army on the city was Octavius or Augustus. He's the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and he was the last man standing after all these civil wars came through. And since he won the civil wars, he decided that he's not going to have any more competition. He's going to have all of his power based around the imperial family. But here's the thing. You don't have to go through any kinds of tests or do anything special to be born into the imperial family. You just have to be lucky. Meaning that you're going to have a lot of emperors who have no clue what they're doing. Worse, you're going to have emperors who are just insane. Not only that, is that eventually this imperial family will all run out, and then after that, it's basically like anyone's game, which is where this big army comes into effect. Rome is powerful because of the army. The emperor has power because of the army. So, with spanning the whole Mediterranean world is very important. So here's the Mediterranean Sea. And so the reason why this is so important is because at this time, land travel is super duper expensive because it's slow. There are no cars. You need to feed all of your horses and anything else that you're using to pull things along. You need to pay and feed guards to stop bandits. And it's kind of risky because, what if it gets attacked and what if you don't have enough guards? So what you need is sea travel, sea trade, uh, because boats are faster, can get a lot more delivered at once, and that means they're going to be cheaper, much, much, much cheaper. It's going to be much easier to communicate across the Roman Empire as long as you're in the Mediterranean. And so that's why the Mediterranean is so helpful, because as you can tell, it's kind of like sheltered, meaning it's very calm. So the chances that your boat is going to get sunk in a storm are very low. And you can also you can always stay close to the coast in case there is a storm. So things aren't. It's like the Mediterranean is kind of like the lifeblood of the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire eventually loses the Mediterranean, that's what collapses it. Yeah, so that's Rome for now. So let's go on to Judaism, because yeah, this was something we kind of neglected in our last week. But Judaism is one of the world's oldest religions. It's what we think of as an ethnic religion, because you can't really convert to Judaism. I mean, it is possible in some sects, but it's not for most. Um, and so another thing about Judaism is it's monotheistic, which means there's only one God. Contrast this with the Roman system, where they have a bunch of gods. That's called polytheistic. So this is very unusual because, well, I guess like everyone else is polytheistic. But one other thing that makes it kind of hard to be Jewish at this time is when the Roman Empire expands. Let's go back to this, where they're taking all these other things from other areas. Is they do the same thing to religions, because when Rome conquers, say, Greece, they find all these Greek gods, and they see, oh wow, look at that. That's Zeus. That's very similar to Jupiter. So I guess they're just the same thing, really. Oh, Athena, that's Minerva. Like they love just bringing all of these other religions into their own to say, okay, we were following the same gods all along. We can all get along really well. So yeah, but then here's the issue: Jews, for them, God is, you may have one God and no other. So it's going to be very hard for the Romans and Jews to get along. By the way, the Jews live in Judea down here. So Judaism, though, will be very influential, because later we'll get Christianity and then Islam. So let's first let's just talk about Christianity, since Islam will be next week. So Christianity starts with some Jewish guy named Jesus, running around in Roman Judea around 30 CE. He gets executed because he's been preaching equality, which the Romans don't like. And he's also been preaching, love thy neighbor, all that kind of stuff. And, well, the Romans don't like that, so they kill him. His disciples, though, after he dies, sees a bunch of cool things happening. And they feel that, wow, wait, Jesus was more than just a person. He was the Son of God. So they, turn this into a religion. And initially, this is very similar to Judaism. The big difference, really, other than Jesus being God, which the Jews don't believe, is that you can convert to Christianity, meaning that Christianity can spread, while Judaism is fine with just staying worshipped by the Jews. For now, though, they face the same issues as the Jews, though, because the Romans don't like monotheism, again, because they can't turn it into their own religion. So the Romans start attacking Christians, and it's actually illegal to be a Christian. But that's only for now. So I guess next, let's move further east to Iran, or Persia. This area is the crossroads of the world. This is where trade from China, Europe, Africa, it all meets up together. India too. It all meets up together, making this area extremely valuable, extremely rich. This is just an idea of where the Iranian empires will typically look like. So Iranian society is very interesting because because most of the time it was spent being ruled by non-Iranians. But then Iran still survived, or at least the idea of Iran, because Iran as an identity was very like tied to Iranian bureaucracy and the Iranian ability to rule themselves. And because Iranian bureaucracy is just so well organized that pretty much every empire that conquers Iran will eventually start using the Iranian system, and then they'll slowly become Iranian, at least culturally. The Iranians are also Zoroastrian. Zoroastrianism is a belief that in these two conflicting gods, like a good god and an evil god, and they all fight each other, and it's all like this fight between the night and day, good and evil, white and black. Not the races, but yeah, like it's all like this dualistic fight between good and evil. And part of this is that Zoroastrianism also supports like a class system, which is the normal thing, social pyramids. You've probably heard about those. And also, Zoroastrians, though, or the Iranians, typically tolerated other religions, since if you remember, crossroads of the world means that all these other people are going to be passing through with all these different religions. Not only this is that since it's an empire, which means there's more than one like ethnicity or more than one religion, that you're going to have to be tolerant. Otherwise, everyone's going to come in and rebel against you. So, let's go next to the people who succeed Alexander after he conquers the Achaemenids, the Seleucids, who are Greeks. Even though this empire looks like it should be centered in Iran, it really isn't. It's focused in Syria. And why? Well, it's because all the other successors are on the Mediterranean, and the Seleucids are a Mediterranean kingdom. They're very westward facing. They're much less eastward facing, which will present some issues later. But it also means that this Seleucid empire will connect the west and the east, meaning that you can have trade between the Mediterranean, India, and China. Sorry. My throat is very dry from recording this several times. So, the Seleucids will fight like the successors, the Romans, and the Mauryans, and then eventually the Parthians, but you'll see who they are later. So, since all the Seleucid attention is on the west, you have the Parthians, who are nomads. They're from the steppe, which is from this area up here, which is all like cold grassland. That's not very good for growing food, but it's good for raising animals, and animals need to move around, which is why they're nomads. They're very good with horses, which, as you can see here. The Parthians initially served as hired soldiers for the Seleucids in their wars against everyone else. But when the Seleucids start losing, the Parthians spot a giant opportunity, and they take over Iran and become the ruling class of Iran. After the Seleucids get eaten by Rome, the Parthians will end up having their border with Rome, which ends up with quite a lot of conflicts, but the Parthians never really lose, which is more than most people can say against fighting against Rome. The Parthians also, over time, will become more and more Iranian, as they rely on Iranian bureaucracy and Iranian wealth. But after the Parthians probably get hammered way too hard by the Romans for too long, combined with a bunch of other like internal issues, the Iranians overthrow the Parthians, and they become the Sasanian dynasty. The Sasanians will become the Roman Empire's most persistent enemy, because Rome and Persia will slap at each other for the next 400 years, until both of them end up getting attacked by the Muslims, which is, I guess, a topic for a later day. I mean, the Sasanians are very rich. Rome, the Sasanians, and China, up until 651, will be like the three great civilizations of the world. So speaking of China, let's go there. So China has called itself the Middle Kingdom, and you'll kind of see why later. So it's also very old. You can tell by how blurry this is that this is a very, very long timeline that requires really more attention than we're really giving it. But let's like right now we're going to be starting with the Warring States period. So, well, the thing is, what ends the Warring States period is one of these states, the Qin, um, underneath Qin Shi Huangdi, and oh god, I probably really mispronounced that. Anyways, uh, the whole thing though is at this time all of the armies of these warring states were chariots, and so the chariots are, as you probably might remember from the Bronze Age collapse week, is chariots are expensive, and it takes forever to train nobles to use chariots. It takes like 20 years to raise a charioteer. And so, like, if you lose a battle with your chariots, you might be done with. But what the Qin come up with is using a lot of foot soldiers who are cheaper, more replaceable, and way easier to train. Which I guess those are the same thing, really, um, because they're using spears and crossbows. And I know from experience that spears are very easy to use, and they're very cost effective. So this Qin with their big army of just like just throw soldiers at them until they run out of their own soldiers. First, they can go sneak through, and then they can take over all of China while no one else is really looking. So the emperor of the Qin, or the first and last Qin emperor, is Qin Shi Huang, who is kind of a bad guy. He's always paranoid that his people are going to rebel, and so he always kills a lot of people. He also really wants to become immortal, and then being the smartest man in the world, he starts drinking poisonous metal to do so. Doesn't work out, as you can tell by the fact that he's dead. Um, another thing is that the reason why the people don't rebel against the Qin is like, one, their big army, but then two, it's because everyone has just lived through the warring states, and no one wants to go back to that. Like, that's is a period of a lot of turmoil, and where you can't really be sure of anything. At least now you can be sure that there's going to be some stability, but and part of that is through standardization. Like the Qin create modern China. That's where you get China from Qin, where they standardize all of these other different writing systems from all the other different states, and they all turn it into one thing that forms what eventually becomes modern China. Oh, geez. They also standardized like currency measurements, all stuff like that, and that's a good thing because you're bringing China together. On the other hand, though, to bring China together, you need to stop all these people who might actually start thinking for themselves, which is so dangerous and evil. So instead, what you got to do, according to Qin Shi Huang, is you got to kill all of them. You got to burn all their books. Yeah. And especially Confucians, who he really didn't like. I'm going to go here. So the reason why he didn't like this is because he was a legalist. And legalism is the idea that, okay, the government is always right. And even if it's wrong, it has to be right. Because you need everyone to be living in a good society that's stable, in which no one ever questions the government, because maybe if people start questioning the government, you'll end back with the warring states. Yeah, because it is a response to the warring states, and so it's basically like everything is better than anarchy, which is like no government. So like part of what legalism allows Qin Shi Huang to do is mobilize a lot of people, because even if you don't get paid while working for Qin Shi Huang, if you say no to one of his projects, if they tell you, okay, come work on this big wall we're building, you say no, they'll probably chop your head off. So you say yes. And so he can mobilize huge numbers of workers to go build things like the Great Wall and his own tomb. And he thought, okay, after I die, I'll become great immortal being who rules over the world. So he has a really nice tomb. He also has an army of clay soldiers. Each one of these is individual, and then there are thousands of them, which is quite um, no, quite the achievement. This kind of just goes to show that like no other country, like not even Rome, will be able to come to this level of being able to organize this many people together. So this is why I guess I'll go to the Han. Wait, no, the Han, who are the second imperial dynasty of China. They, uh, after the Qin collapse, the Han succeed them, and they are Confucians. They're not legalists. So they are like, okay, the emperor is your father, obey the emperor. And, well, I mean, and they're much more chill about, like, about opposition than the Qin were. They're still not, like, great about it, but they're also not killing everyone that they vaguely suspect of being related to someone who might know someone whose dog was against the emperor. uh, and they also opened the Silk Road with Europe, and also not just Europe. Eventually, this will also be with India and Iran, especially. And part of this, well, this will be incredibly important because if you remember just like how many people China has, means that uh, anywhere where you're going to be producing goods, you're probably going to be best. The best place to sell it will be China because there's so much demand as there's so many people to sell things to. It's a great market. And what this means is that China will be the center of the world. All of the world's silver will eventually end up in China, and it will be like the richest place on earth for the next 1600 years, which is why it's the Middle Kingdom. Uh, though, don't get too attached to the Han, though. Well, so this is where I left off, where I ended the lecture in class, as we're going to be continuing this next week. So, yeah, thank you for sitting through this. I really hope you enjoyed this. And please do ask me if you have any issues. Sorry, I am having some issues myself right now because I need water. So, well, yeah, thank you. I'm really sorry about the Zoom IDs and passwords. And I guess I'll see you later. Thank you.